Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and today I want to have with you a full discussion on how to deadhead various perennials, shrubs, annuals. But first I have to talk about what is deadheading. This is a columbine or Achillea, and it looks like this when in full bloom, but of course this now has started to go to seed or make seed heads. And for three different reasons, you might consider doing a snip. And in this case, a snip right down low here on the flower stems, taking them right off. Number one reason would be to tidy things up in your garden. I don't know how tidy a gardener you are, but certainly on annuals and some perennials, those spent flowers can be a little bit messy, so removal will make them look a little bit better. The second reason you might do that is, like on this Achillea, it may tend to self-seed around the garden, and there are lots of perennials that do that. If it's unwanted, you may want to do the deadheading first and get rid of those spent stems so that they won't spread their seeds around the garden. And third reason, most importantly, the one I do it for, is to get and convince your perennials to bloom again. So they're doing what their part in reproducing around the garden is to develop those seeds. And if you interrupt that process by removing the flowers once they're spent, oftentimes that will encourage them to send a new stem of flowers. I'm going to show you which perennials that works on, which perennials it won't, some shrubs as well. Let's go through it together. Just really quickly as we get going here, I'm going to talk about three different life cycles of plants: annuals, perennials, and shrubs, and their deadheading situation varies between the three different groups a little bit. The annuals are pretty much 100% will benefit from deadheading, either just to keep them tidy during their bloom cycles, extend their bloom cycles, or get them to repeat. So annuals I will only talk about very briefly here because they're pretty much all the same. Second one is perennials, where most of them will benefit from deadheading, and there are some exceptions that I will tell you that don't bother. It doesn't really work for them. And shrubs are like the reverse situation. Most shrubs will not work from deadheading, will not repeat bloom no matter what you do. And then there's just a small subsection of shrubs that will, and I will talk about those as well. So talking about the annuals really quickly here, the way to deadhead them is sort of like you can individually pick off spent flowers as you see them on the thing, and that will clean them up as they go. Or if they get to the stage where they've actually bloomed out as a group here, and let's imagine that all of these were bloomed out and you just wanted to refresh the growth and get it to bloom again, you could pick a point where there's still some foliage, you're not trying to cut it right down to a nub, and just trimming off the spent blooms and bringing it back down to a pleasing shape and form. That's going to be the right way to get your annuals back into blooming. And what I just did there actually is I'm going to call it a version of deadheading called staging. Like, let's say you had a whole bunch of these in pots, and prematurely you cut some of them back like this to make sure that some of them are in bloom at one point, and then when those ones are finished, these ones are ready to come up behind them. So it's a way of scheduling the blooms on your plants, staging them. Let's talk about the perennials that benefit from deadheading first. And while I'm doing this, over on the screen over here somewhere, I'm going to start putting up a list of the plants, of the perennials that actually do benefit from deadheading, and then I'm going to show you some technique here. So this is a salvia here. It's definitely in the group that benefits from it. You can see it's got a spent flower over here, but it's also got buds developing down low here. So probably in that case I would be a little bit selective. Take it off right here, still leaving some of those buds in place, but just leave the rest of the perennial looking good. So now looking at this dianthus here, you can see that it's at an earlier stage here where it has lots of buds coming into flower here, but it just has some spent blooms down here. If I wanted to do that with the blade, I would just take that stem off right here selectively. You could also just pinch it off with your fingers, no big deal. This one here is in the same stage, fresher bloom at the top here, but spent blooms down low, so take those out just to keep it tidy and fresh and to encourage some of those extra blooms to come. I'm going to show you here that here is an armeria, and adjusting upwards so you can see the flowers on this, that some of them are a little bit browner and spent now, and you can again just choose how selective you want to be here. So I can take off the brown stems. In this case the foliage is basal, so I'm just taking off the flower stems as close to the foliage as I want to. And if I still think that there's a good enough amount of color left on here, with just these ones here that still look fairly fresh, then I'll just leave those on. Or what you can do is you can wait, and this is my preference because I'm kind of a lazy gardener, you can wait until they're basically all spent, and then you can kind of ponytail them like this and take them all off at once, sort of encouraging a new fresh crop or flush of flowers to come up in its place. Going back to that salvia, because it's a little bit of a different structure, it's not basal like the foliage on the armeria. All of these have kind of flower spikes that have leaves on them going all the way up, and so you have to choose an arbitrary point along there, assuming we got to the point where we wanted to take off a whole bunch of spent flowers at the same time. And what I would do is I would look at the condition of the foliage, but I'd probably pick a point somewhere along these lines here where you're leaving a good 6 inches or 8 inches of basal leaves, but cutting off a good portion of those flowering stems and just tidying it up and looking for a pleasing shape for it to begin again and start sending new flower spikes. And while we're still in the perennials here, I wanted to mention about that staging thing. These were in full color about a week ago, all fresh blooms, but what I did is at that time went through and actually cut the back half of this crop, or the back 2/3 of this crop, downwards, and you can see that it's already having its effect of getting some of these to send brand new blooms, so that by the time these ones in the front aren't looking so good, and they're getting there now, that I'm going to have some plants in color for sale in the meantime. And this works in your garden as well, is if you have a whole bunch of different patches of a particular salvia or armeria or agastache, you can stage them back to get some of them blooming while the other ones are still finishing their first flush of blooms. That range of perennials that will respond to deadheading to get more flowers is why dianthus and salvia, as I showed, are classic choices of this, but even things like lupins or foxgloves, or like these violas or pansies, will repeat as long as they're still in the season where they like to bloom. Pansies really prefer the cooler season, so it might not be worth doing if you're getting into the heat of summer, but early on, yes, if they're spent, go ahead and give them a trim down, right at the same level I mentioned for the salvia, sort of to their foliage and taking off most of the flowers, and you're good to go. There are some perennials that just are not meant to rebloom, and in this case I'm going to talk about oriental poppies or daylilies or hellebores or peonies like this one here. Just will not rebloom no matter what you do, and I'll put up a list on the screen here of ones that just aren't worth trying, except if what you're trying to do is just tidy them up or stop them from reseeding. That still can be worth doing for deadheading, but it won't convince them to rebloom. Moving along, there are only a handful of shrubs that will actually rebloom if deadheaded. Roses, modern roses being one of them, also butterfly bush, some hydrangeas, some spireas, some potentillas, and maybe a few abelias, all depending on their breeding. So they're just more reluctant as a group to rebloom once deadheaded. When it comes to roses, the method is basically the same. If you just have 1 or 2 spent flowers, probably just makes sense to grab them like this and snap them off with your hand and leave the rest of the shrub alone. Let's go inside, I'll show you some that have a little bit more bloomed out. Well, here's a rose that has some fresh blooms on it, and then of course this one here is starting to come apart in the center, very faded edges. So on this one here, I'm going to count back to the leaf set that has 5 leaflets on it and just cut above that just to get rid of that bloom, and that leaves all of the remaining buds and other fresh blooms in place. On a cluster flowering rose, it probably just makes sense to pinch out the 1 or 2 that have blown, just leaving the rest of the fresh ones in place. And once a whole flower cluster looks spent and faded, then it makes sense to go back on the stem behind the entire flower cluster and give it a snip to bring the shrub back into shape and to encourage more blooms. Well, that's pretty much all I have for you today on deadheading. I will revisit the topic through the season as my perennial gardens come into bloom. I'll be able to give you some additional examples on that. Remember that if you're trying to encourage more blooms, pretty much when it comes to annuals, you can do no wrong. You'll always benefit in general from deadheading, even if you're just picking off some flowers. With perennials, yes, most of the time you'll be able to get some additional blooming. And with shrubs, no, not so much unless you're looking at roses or butterfly bush. Everything else, it would just be for the sake of tidiness. I hope they found that useful at this stage in the season as we're getting going. And if you have any questions, please drop them down in the comments below the video and I'll see what I can do to help.